On December 31, 1994, a force of roughly 2,700 Russian soldiers sat on the outskirts of Grozny waiting for orders that would kill almost every single one of them. They didn't know that yet. Nobody did. But the signs were already there for anyone paying attention. The army they belonged to was a skeleton of what the Soviet Union once commanded. Underfunded, undertrained, stitched together from whatever units could be scraped up on short notice. Most of them were 18 years old, conscripts, boys who had been handed a rifle, given basic weapons training, and told to climb onto armored vehicles that in some cases didn't even have trained drivers. Officers had to drive the tanks themselves. Some tanks rolled out without ammunition loaded into their machine guns. There were no written orders, no operational plan worth the name. The president of Russia had publicly declared that Grozny would be taken in 2 hours. 2 hours. As if a city of nearly 400,000 people, defended by thousands of battle-hardened fighters, would simply hand over the keys. Because columns of armor showed up on its doorstep. That arrogance would be paid for in blood, not by the men who made the decision, but by the boys sitting on those tanks in the freezing cold wondering what was about to happen. The idea, if you could call it that, was simple. For armored columns would enter the city simultaneously from different directions and converge on the presidential palace at the center, a massive show of force that would supposedly make the Chechen defenders surrender without a fight. But by the time the order came down, only 2 columns were even available. One brigade had already been hit by friendly artillery fire and pulled back. An entire parachute regiment simply refused the order to attack. They looked at the plan and said no. So what remained was the northern group under General Pilakovsky, the 131st Maikop Motor Rifle Brigade and the 81st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. They were told to move, and they moved. At roughly noon, the columns rolled into Grozny in long convoy formations. Vehicles spaced barely 5 meters apart, one behind the other, driving straight down the main roads, as if this were a parade through a friendly town. No infantry screening ahead, no reconnaissance, teams clearing buildings, no flanking elements securing the route, just a long line of steel. Driving slowly into the unknown, at the entrance to the city, someone had spray-painted a message in red on the road sign. "Welcome to hell." The soldiers saw it. Some laughed nervously. Others said nothing. They kept driving, and for the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The streets were empty. No gunfire. No explosions. No people anywhere. The city looked completely abandoned. But it wasn't. Lights glowed in apartment windows. Streetlights were on. Everything appeared normal except for the total absence of life. And with every block they passed in silence, the commanders grew more confident. This was going to be easy. They were going to take the city without a fight. That silence was the last mercy Grozny would offer them. It was the deep breath before the scream. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the lead elements of the 131st Maikop Brigade reached the Grozny railway station, deep in the heart of the city. They had driven straight through without a single shot fired at them. Not one round, not one RPG, not one sniper, nothing. And that silence did exactly what it was designed to do. It made them believe they were safe. The vehicles pulled up to the station and parked in neat orderly rows, as if arriving at a garrison back home. Tanks lined up side by side. BMPs clustered together in tight formations. Nobody dismounted to secure the surrounding buildings. Nobody established defensive perimeters. Nobody placed lookouts on the rooftops or sent teams into the apartments and offices towering above them on every side. The infantry did what untrained conscripts do when no one gives them clear instructions. They stayed inside their vehicles or wandered into the railway station building itself. Some smoked cigarettes, some sat on the armor. They waited for further orders that would never come in time. What none of them knew was that the railway station sat in the most dangerous position imaginable. It was located directly between the outer and inner defensive rings the Chechen fighters had meticulously constructed around the presidential palace. The 131st had driven blind through the first ring without realizing it existed, and parked themselves squarely in the gap between two concentric circles of entrenched enemy fighters. They were surrounded on every side, Chechen positions in front of them, behind them, on their left flank, on their right flank, above them in the buildings, below them in the basements, and they had absolutely no idea. Meanwhile, the second assault group, following roughly 20 minutes behind, was still making its way through the city streets. They would never reach the station, and on a separate route along Pervomeyskaya Street, the 81st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment was still pushing toward the Presidential Palace Square, completely unaware that the trap was minutes from snapping shut on them too. Then something happened that makes this story unlike almost any other in modern warfare. A voice came through the Russian radio frequency. It was Turpal Ali Ajuriev, a Chechen field commander. He called for Colonel Ivan Savin, commander of the 131st, by his nickname Alec. They knew each other. They had served together years ago in the Soviet military. Two men who had once worn the same uniform, now standing on opposite sides of what was about to become a massacre. Ajuriev did not taunt him. He did not threaten him. He pleaded with him. He told Savin to give the order to turn around and get his men out of the city. He told him that he did not want the bloodbath to happen, that no one on his side wanted it either. The conversation was calm, almost friendly between two soldiers who understood exactly what was coming. Savin listened. He understood completely. But he told Ajuriev that he could not give the order. His orders came from above, and he would follow them. There was nothing he could do. That conversation ended. Savin would never leave the city alive. Ajuriev survived this battle, but was captured during the Second Chechen War and died in a Russian prison in 2002. Shortly after that exchange, a new transmission came through the Russian frequency, just for words. Welcome to hell. Then Grozny exploded, and a coordinated assault that erupted across the entire city at once. Chechen fighters who had been sitting silently in buildings along every major street opened fire. The 81st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment on Pervomeyskaya Street was hit first. RPG slammed into the lead vehicle of the column, and it erupted into flames. Before anyone could react, the rear vehicle was hit too. The column was boxed in. Dozens of tanks and armored vehicles trapped bumper to bumper, and a narrow street with burning wrecks blocking both ends. There was no way forward, no way back, no way to turn around. Chechen fire teams had positioned themselves exactly where Russian armor was blind. They knew the T-72 and T-80 turrets couldn't elevate high enough to hit the upper floors of buildings. They knew the guns couldn't depress low enough to reach RPG teams firing from basements. So that is exactly where they put their fighters. Upper floors and basements. At 50 meters, the tank gun couldn't hit anything above the 4th floor. And the buildings were on every side, towering over them, and narrow streets. The side armor couldn't stop RPG-7 warheads. The rear armor couldn't stop them. The top armor couldn't stop them, especially not when they were being showered from every direction at almost point-blank range. Tanks started brewing up one after another. The infamous T-70 to jack-in-the-box effect, turrets blown clean off the hull by their own ammunition, cooking off, filled the streets with fire and smoke and metal. Many of these tanks didn't even have explosive reactive armor installed. Those that did had the older Contact 1 variant, which couldn't stop tandem warheads or repeated hits. And some had the aero blocks bolted on, but the explosive inserts were never actually loaded inside them. They were empty boxes welded to dead machines carrying dead men. The infantry inside the BMPs was supposed to dismount and support the tanks. They didn't. They couldn't. They were 18-year-old boys with no urban warfare training who had never been told what to do when the world started exploding around them. Their instinct was to stay behind the armor, so they stayed inside, and horribly many of them stayed inside forever. Chechen fighters walked right up to buttoned-up vehicles and put RPG rounds through them. At point-blank range, Those who tried to bail out of burning vehicles were cut down instantly by machine gun fire and snipers positioned in windows above. Among the forces that swarmed toward the railway station was the Abkhazian Battalion, Chechen fighters who were veterans of the war in Abkhazia. These were not local militia. These were battle-hardened men with years of real combat experience who had designed their entire defense around exploiting every single weakness of the Russian military. They had served in that very military just a few years earlier. They knew how every weapon system worked. They knew how to defeat each one. They knew Russian doctrine and tactics inside and out. They predicted every step the Russians made that day, and they were prepared to counter each one. The 81st Guards Regiment was essentially destroyed on the streets within hours. Survivors scattered in every direction, trying to fight their way out over the following days. Most of them were killed or captured. The Chechens had even replaced the street signs throughout the city to confuse them further. Russian soldiers who tried to navigate had no proper maps. They had no idea where they were or which direction led out. They were driving deeper into the kill zone thinking they were escaping it. At the railway station, the 131st was now under full assault from every direction. The second assault group that had been following 20 minutes behind never arrived. They had been ambushed along the route and annihilated before reaching the station. The men of the 131st were alone, surrounded, and the buildings around them were on fire. The frantic fighting at the railway station continued through the night, as Chechen fighters poured fire from every direction onto what remained of the 131st Maikop Brigade. Russian commanders inside the city tried desperately to organize some kind of coherent defense, but it was impossible. The chaos was total. The confusion was absolute. There was no plan for this because there had never been a plan at all. The radios they were communicating on were old Soviet models, completely unencrypted. The Chechens had the exact same radios. They could listen to every single word the Russians were saying in a language they spoke fluently themselves. They didn't just listen, they talked back. There is a recording of a Chechen fighter laughing over the Russian radio frequency. That was recovered during the research of this battle. The sound of the laughter alone is enough to stop your blood cold. Now imagine hearing it while your friends are burning alive in the vehicle next to you. The Chechens, on the other hand, had brand new Motorola handheld radios for nearly every fire team. They could coordinate their attacks without the Russians hearing a word. And they used this advantage to create a nightmare that went far beyond the ambush itself. Chechen fighters took Russian uniforms from the dead end because they spoke the language without any accent. They infiltrated Russian lines. They moved through the sewer systems and positioned themselves between two Russian units, then opened fire on both sides before slipping away. Two Russian units fought each other for 6 straight hours on January 1st. Because of this, they had no way to tell who was who. Both sides had the same equipment, the same vehicles, the same weapons. By the time they realized the mistake, it was already too late. Reinforcements that tried to push into the city to help the trapped soldiers were fired upon, not only by Chechen fighters, but by Russian soldiers in complete disarray who were now shooting at everything that moved. On the morning of January 1st, Russian jets and helicopters finally arrived to provide air support. They helped by bombing their own western group. Nobody had told the pilots that friendly forces were positioned there, so they mistook them for the enemy and hit them with cluster munitions. Several vehicles were destroyed and dozens of friendly soldiers were killed by their own air force. It is estimated that friendly fire accounted for as high as 60% of all Russian casualties. In the Battle of Grozny, even if the number is wrong by half, it is still beyond horrifying. Their present for New Year's Eve was a ceasefire, 15 minutes before midnight, 15 minutes after midnight, then the killing started again. The 131st Support Battalion entered the city in a desperate attempt to reach the trapped soldiers at the station. They were ambushed and wiped out before they could get anywhere close. By January 1st, the 131st had been trapped at the railway station for roughly 24 hours. Between 300 and 350 of their men were already dead. Ammunition was almost gone. The wounded were piling up with no medical supplies left to treat them. Surrender was not an option for most. Those who tried to surrender were mostly shot on the spot. Some who were captured faced a fate worse than death. Others were captured, treated for their wounds, and released later, even without exchange for Chechen prisoners. It depended entirely on which unit found you and what kind of commander they had. Colonel Savin was still alive, still in command, still wounded from nearly the start of the battle. He had been calling for help over the radio for hours. No help was coming. He knew it now. Everyone knew it. At sundown on January 1st, Savin made the decision to try to evacuate the most critically wounded. He loaded roughly 40 of the worst cases onto the last 3 operational vehicles and sent them out. The vehicles drove out but went the wrong direction, toward the city center instead of away from it. They turned around and tried to retreat back the way they came. They were immediately ambushed by Chechen or PG teams. None of the 3 vehicles made it out of the city. 13 men from those vehicles survived to be taken prisoner. The rest were dead. Command back at headquarters told the surrounded soldiers to take civilian hostages, to negotiate their extraction. The Chechens didn't respond. They also suggested the trapped soldiers try to sneak to friendly lines under cover of darkness, as if men who were bleeding out in a burning building hadn't already thought of that themselves. It was now January 2nd, and what remained of the 131st Maikop Brigade was barely alive. Buildings around the railway station were shattered by RPG fire, and hand grenades thrown through every opening. Close quarters fighting raged from room to room, floor to floor, growing more desperate by the hour. Russian soldiers were almost completely out of ammunition. Some were firing their last magazines. Some had nothing left at all. Colonel Savin had been wounded since nearly the beginning of the battle and had refused evacuation every single time. He had watched his brigade be torn apart around him for over 30 hours. He had called for help that never came. He had sent vehicles out that never made it. He had done everything a commander could do with nothing. Now he made the hardest call of all. Without waiting for orders from above, he gave the command to abandon the railway station and leave the city on foot under cover of darkness. On the night of January 2nd, the survivors left the station, moving along the railroad ties in total silence. No shooting, no talking, just footsteps in the dark. They made it about 70 meters before nerves started breaking. Discipline was falling apart. These men were shell-shocked, exhausted, some barely able to walk, some carrying wounded comrades on their backs. The Chechens did not pursue them. While moving through the darkened streets, they stumbled upon 3 BMPs from a different unit, the Samurai Regiment. Savin ordered the most critically wounded loaded onto these vehicles and sent them driving toward friendly lines. The first BMP carried Savin himself along with the worst of the wounded. It was hit by a grenade launcher almost immediately. The vehicle lurched to a stop and Savin was thrown from the wreckage mortally wounded. He died shortly after beside his burning vehicle on a street in a city. He had been ordered to take in 2 hours. He was posthumously awarded Hero of the Russian Federation for his actions in trying to save what was left of his brigade. The second BMP carrying wounded was also hit and destroyed. The third managed to push through, but was struck again further down the road. Those who survived either ran out of the city on foot or were captured later, wandering the streets in shock. From the 131st Maikop Brigade alone, the numbers tell a story that no words can soften. 789 men killed, 75 captured. Only about 60 reached safety. 20 of 26 tanks destroyed. 102 of 120 armored vehicles destroyed. All Tunguska anti-aircraft systems destroyed. 24 officers dead, including Colonel Savin. The entire 1st Battalion, roughly 300 men and 40 armored vehicles, ceased to exist as a unit. Across all formations committed to the Battle of Grozny, in those opening days, an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 Russian soldiers were killed. Around 100 of 120 tanks committed were destroyed. Russia proportionally lost more tanks in the streets of Grozny than the Soviet Union lost. In the Battle of Berlin in 1945, 1,596 Russian soldiers from the First Chechen War remain listed as missing in action to this day. In 2008, a mass grave containing roughly 800 bodies was uncovered in Grozny. After the disaster, the Russian military completely abandoned the use of armored columns in urban combat. They shifted to massive sustained artillery bombardment, firing an estimated 30,000 shells per day into the city. It was the heaviest bombardment campaign in Europe since the Second World War. It killed thousands of civilians, most of them ethnic Russians who had nowhere to go and no way to leave. Through the following month, they systematically leveled the city block by block and attacked with infantry until the Chechen defenders retreated into the mountains. The city was taken back by Chechen forces in 1996 in a stunning counterattack, after which negotiations began. The Second Chechen War came in 1999 under Vladimir Putin, where the lessons of Grozny were applied with devastating and indiscriminate force. Heavy bombardment replaced armored assaults, and the city was destroyed once more. Russia won the war and installed a controlled government that remains in power today. But the Battle of Grozny on New Year's Eve 1994 stands as one of the most catastrophic military failures in modern history. Not because the soldiers failed. They fought with everything they had and more than anyone had the right to ask of them. It failed because men in comfortable offices thousands of kilometers away made decisions they would never have to live with. They sent untrained boys into a city they had no plan to take with equipment that didn't work against an enemy they didn't understand. And when those boys died by the hundreds, the men who sent them, there faced no consequences at all. That is the lesson of Grozny. That is what should never be forgotten.